Report. Joining us now, Charles Falconer, Labour's former Lord Chancellor, and joining us from Southampton, Tobias Ellwood, former Conservative Defence Minister who experienced firsthand the scene of a London terror attack where he gave first aid. Charles, I'm going to start with you. Do you think it is ever possible to know if you have de-radicalised somebody?
I'm sure it's not possible to know with certainty, but in some cases de-radicalisation will be successful. We should certainly not stop having de-radicalisation programmes, but the Usman Khan case does raise incredible questions about how successful our de-radicalisation programmes are, and separately from that, how good the intelligence within prisons is about whether or not somebody has been successfully de-radicalised, because that depends to a very large extent on effective, experienced prison officers being able to make judgments, because this is the case of Usman Khan is a series of judgments that turned out to be wrong, and it's making the right judgment about people that is so important.
So when questions are raised, we both know policies tend to be rearranged or things kick in. We know that 74 people have been released on licence. What should happen to them now? What will happen to them now? What would you suggest?
I think what the Ministry of Justice are doing is the right thing, which is examining whether or not their licence conditions are being complied with. The Usman Khan case makes us incredibly vigilant to see whether or not there are signs with these 74 that there may be problems. One, for example, of the 74, he had a mobile phone additional to the one that he was allowed to have. That gives rise to the possibility that he is making communication with people that he shouldn't be doing. So we need to look at this very, very carefully. But the premise of this whole discussion is you can never be certain. But that does not mean you shouldn't do it. They should be better than they are, the de-radicalisation programmes. We cannot have a situation where there are 200 to 300 people in prison for terrorist offences who we are not going to consider for release, because that will make the position overall in the long term worse.
The Times tomorrow is saying that 200 extremists now face curbs and crackdowns. So that's another 200 who will probably find themselves, under more severe licence or even in prison as a result of this?
I'm not sure whether these 200 are ones who are not in prison or haven't been convicted, but if they are 200 who are not the subject of a conviction, what they mean is something called a tip-in order, which will mean that they'll be subject to restrictions about where they live, where they can visit and who they can see.
Tobias, Charlie made the point that it all comes down to judgment, and when we look at all the people that have been in charge of the prison systems, whether it's the prisons ministers, whether it's justice ministers, we see how many have left. There have been 5 justice secretaries in the last 10 years, Gove, Truss, Liddington, Gaunt, Buckland, 3 prison ministers, Roy Stewart, Robert Buckland, Lucy Fraser. Many of these people have now left your party altogether, if not politics altogether. Is that where the crux of this problem lies? There isn't the judgment anymore, there isn't the expertise there.
I don't agree with that at all. The party, the government creates policy, but as Lord Falconer implied, and indeed it was in your opening piece, these are operational judgments taken by people on the front line who are experts in their field, but it is a developing field. We're having to come to terms with a judicial system that was never created to deal with people that want to take their life, that have a false interpretation of the Quran, that are willing to kill, believing that they're going to get a fast track to paradise. And we're having to learn very fast, not just in this country, but in other countries around the world. And yes, we must all put our hands up and say mistakes were made here by the prison service, by the probation, by the Court of Appeal, by judges as well. And look very carefully and learn from this to make sure that we keep Britain safe. But I don't think it's wise to proportion blame just because there is ministerial churn. That happens in every department. More to do it is the strategy that's in place. And if I must just say that the channel and the prevent strategies are actually copied across the world in other parts in our counter-dash efforts. And that's so important to recognise that it's working well but not good enough, and we have to advance it.
When you look at terrorism-related activity and the number of people in prison for it, that's risen 74% from 2010 to 2019. Does that tell you that the Conservative government has got it right? Are you happy to see that rise of 74%? Or does it suggest that that is too many?
Clearly, it is too many, but you've got to ask yourself, why are people being radicalised in the first place? Why are we getting people who are inspired by extremism, of taking this message, whether it be online or so forth? That is where we also have to look. It is people who are vulnerable. It's perhaps in the prison population as well. Ian Aitchison made a report to say that they should not be put in the general prisons population. That is a recommendation which I think Lord Carlisle, if the Conservatives win the next election, will be taking forward. We absolutely have to learn from this, but we also recognise that there is a series of stakeholders here that each must look at their own part of their jigsaw to improve.
I don't think that has been followed up with by the government entirely, but the question of how to treat terrorism and how to treat ideology, do you think of it as a separate crime? Do you look at the philosophy or the creed behind it, or do you just say, this is criminality, it is criminality in gangs, and you treat it like you would any other crime?
Well, the horror of the crime has to be judged as a crime, but the questions that you're raising about how you then treat it have to be dealt with within the prison system. Should you have a separate system for terrorism where you never let the terrorists out because of the risk they pose, because of all the questions you ask? I am sure that is absolutely the wrong answer. I'm also very doubtful about the Aitchison recommendations to which you're referring, that they should be separated from everybody else, because you then end up with a military style
prison.
Exactly, where the prisoners themselves, as it were, have hierarchies in which de-radicalisation becomes very difficult.
Does it help to understand the philosophy? I mean,
of course it helps to understand the philosophy, and it's very important that the prison service engage imams who will be engaged with the prison authorities in seeking to de-radicalise. How successful it will be, particularly in a period where the prisons are stretched for other reasons, and if you take that out into the community after somebody is released, maybe after an assessment, you end up with stretched police, stretched probation, all of them who are making the decisions about, for example, could Mr. Usman Khan come to London? Those were decisions made under great pressure.
And by pressure, you're also referring to cuts on one level. We know that some of the worst cuts were to the justice system, 40%. We know that 62% of prisons are overcrowded. Do these now look like mistakes of the past decade, Tobias?
Well, clearly, the environment that we've had to face in dealing not just in the Justice Department, right across the board, in meeting the financial pressures that we inherited in 2010. But these
why can't you just take responsibility for the last decade instead of looking back to the decade before?
I'm not going to duck them. Absolutely. If there's more money, there's more funds available, more resources, they can all help. And clearly what has happened, the tragedy on London Bridge, will focus minds. And the review has been put forward. The Prime Minister has made it clear that more money will be available. But I make it absolutely clear there's not one single answer here. These are very difficult judgments to make. Even if you keep somebody in prison, let's say for 30 to 40 years, you still have to make a judgment on when that person released, is it safe to bring them back into the general population? And that is an operational judgment to be made, not by a minister, but by the front line. And we need to make sure we get it right.
I do strongly agree with what Tobias is saying, but these are amongst the most difficult decisions for the justice system. And the effect of the cuts has meant that in this very difficult area, it's been done where there's huge pressures from elsewhere, and we are developing knowledge over a decade or more, because the problems given rise to by Islamic terrorism is different from that in relation to Irish terrorism, for example, where essentially, if you went to the Northern Irish jails, you saw in effect the terrorists in many places had taken over significant parts of the jail, and we don't want to end up in that situation with the Islamic terrorists.
But before we end, I want to ask you both about an issue that looks as if it will be addressed by any future Conservative government, which is the broader acts of the Constitution. And this is in the Conservative Manifesto, page 49. I don't know if we can just pull this up now and show you what it says. We will ensure that judicial review is available to protect the rights of the individuals against an overbearing state, while ensuring that it is not abused to conduct politics by another means or to create needless delays. This sounds as if, after Brexit says we need to look at the broader aspects of our constitution, the relationship between the government, parliament and the courts. Is this a shifting away from a legal framework to a political framework?
It is, and I've read that, and I'd spotted it sometime before you asked. It's an absolute echo of what the government's response was to the prorogation case, where the Supreme Court said the Prime Minister had acted unlawfully in proroguing for a long period of time. They said it was conducting politics by another means. So I read that bit of the manifesto as meaning there's not going to be any more prorogation cases. So if Mr Johnson becomes Prime Minister again, he won't be restrained by the courts from acting unlawfully. Tobias,
your reflection on that?
Well, I think there's something to be put for the Justice Secretary. I can't see the quote in front of me, but I would be hesitant.
Let me read it to you. It's from the manifesto.
I'd be hesitant to go down the route again. We saw what happened with the Supreme Court. Its verdict was very, very clear indeed. I think it's a distraction from what we need to focus on now. I just wanted to go back, if I may, just to the international part of this. Can I just ask you, just to
clarify that before you go, do you think it is an abuse to try and rewrite the Constitution along those lines, or do you think it is a necessary thing that your party wants to do?
I think the interpretation of what you're reading there is something that you'd have to put to the Justice Secretary. I can't comment on the details on that. I didn't write that part of any part of the manifesto. But if I can just add, we have the NATO summit this week, and it was touched on by yourself and also by Lord Falconer. There is an international element to the terrorism challenge that we face. This isn't just a British thing. It's focused this week on London Bridge. But we need to be united with our Western partners and working with our allies in the Muslim communities and in the Muslim world as well.
Thank you
to
very
recognise
much.
that there needs to be a moderate message that goes through so we can tackle this in the future.
Thank you both.